One, check. 1, 2. Okay, and you got it on line or mic? One, check. 1, 2. Yeah.
I think, JP, are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. All right. Sorry for the late start. It worked out for us because more people showed up. So, sometimes things work out. So this is the meeting for the GSP, and welcome. I'll do a couple announcements. There's a sign-in sheet. If you would do us a favor and sign in before you leave, just so we know you were here. It's very helpful for us to be able to track who's been attending the meetings. I would say we have water, but we don't have water, so sorry about that. There's a drinking fountain out there. And also some informational material about Sigma on the table if you'd like to take that with you as well. So I'll get started. We have some good speakers tonight to talk about a couple of things within the GSP or the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. So this is part of our technical team. And GSP. We also have Dave O'Rourke here. Both Dave and Robert will be presenting tonight. In addition, from GSI, in addition, we have Tim Nicely, Jeff Berry in the audience. They're hiding, but they're here to support the rest of us team. And then we have a couple other members of the team that are not here tonight, but it's a good technical team, a lot of experience with groundwater and Sigma, and so we think we're heading in the right direction. So this is kind of a project approach to develop the groundwater sustainability plan. Under Sigma, as you know, one of the requirements for the GSA is to develop a groundwater sustainability plan. This is broken up into 4 phases, and you kind of see we've already completed phase 1. Things like communication plan, basin setting, describing what is the Carpinteria groundwater basin, conceptual model, how does it work, historic groundwater conditions, what have we seen in the historic record that we have, water budget, which is kind of an accounting of water in and water out, and then groundwater model update. We had a groundwater model completed, the Water District had a groundwater model completed in 2012, and so we've used that to help us continue on with this work and build, update it and build a better model for the purposes of Sigma. So we're done with that. A lot of that discussion was meetings 1 through 3. We're now on meeting 4, and we're in phase 2, where we are hitting what's called the sustainable management criteria. And so here it's termed sustainable goal setting. And basically what that is we've defined we've looked at what is, and then we've defined, or we're starting to define what sustainability is, and then we're also trying to define how do we measure it to make sure that we're in sustainability. Tonight, we'll be focusing on sustainable management criteria in 2 of the, I guess it's 6 indicators that Department of Water Resources has defined. So the first one will be water level decline and reduction in storage. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. Seawater intrusion, sustainable management criteria. So we're a coastal basin. Seawater intrusion to the groundwater basin is a big deal for us. We want to make sure that we operate the groundwater basin in such a way that we don't increase the chances of seawater coming in and basically ruining the groundwater basin. Introduction to water level decline and reduction of storage. So water level, so if you have a well, if you measure down from the ground, that water level is representative of, you know, the water in the groundwater basin. And as you pump it more and more and more, it declines. And that has potential effects on other well users in the area that you're pumping. And so that's one of the areas that DWR has defined that we need to look at as part of groundwater sustainability planning. Storage, which is more of a broad look at the overall basin, and if we're reducing overall storage, in other words, instead of one well, you're looking at 10 or 15 wells, and looking at how much water is being extracted and whether that's lowering the basin, if it's faster than it's able to recharge naturally or with other means. So those are two of the sustainable management criteria that we'll be looking at tonight. We'll also be looking at the future water budget. So one of the things about a plan is you have to look forward. You have to try to estimate what's going to happen in the future. And DWR has laid out a path to do that. They've given us some climate change factors to use, to analyze. We've looked at historic records, and we've come up with an approach to project out what will happen with the climate, what will happen with water use, the groundwater use, how plants will evapotranspire. All those things are believed to change in the future because of climate change conditions. So we'll go through that tonight. We'll continue on in March. We'll continue to talk about the decline in water storage or groundwater storage. We'll move into some other areas, subsidence, which is not really a big issue here, water quality and groundwater. So one of the things that we have to watch out for is if there is an area of the groundwater basin that has pollutants in it, we don't want to mobilize those pollutants to move in any direction. We want to try to contain those. And you can do that hydraulically. And then, again, surface water, rivers in this valley, interaction with groundwater. We have to look at that and make sure that groundwater activities don't affect surface water negatively. And then we'll continue to go in April on the SMCs. And as we wrap up, all 6 of these areas of sustainable management criteria, we'll move into, okay, now we have a definition of what sustainability is for all of these indicators. Now what? Now what do we do with management and projects? We have tools that we can develop to help us get where we need to get. And so we'll move into that in April and on into May. There's some slack in the schedule here. Some of these may take longer than others. What we want to do is make sure that we hear all of the perspectives from the various stakeholders so that we can incorporate that into our thinking as we move through this process. I think as you might see, well, it's not on here, but it is on the website that these meetings are typically the 3rd Wednesday of the month. And so we'll continue to try to keep that pattern until we run out of topics. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert Marks from Pueblo Water Resources. He's going to talk about the future water budget.
Thanks, Bob. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you guys about the projected water budget. At the first workshop in October, I presented on the historical and current water budgets for the basin. GSP regulations require us to develop both or historical water budgets, the current water budget, and the projected water budget. So like I said, I discussed the historical water budget, the methods that we use to calculate the various sources of recharge in the basin, pumping in the basin. So tonight I'm going to talk about the projected water budget and the methodologies that we've used to create that water budget, what the results are of the budget, and then next steps. What are we going to do with this budget as we move through the process here? So what is a projected water budget? Well, basically what it does is it uses, in accordance with the GSP regulations, it uses 50 years of historical hydrologic data and then projects that forward 50 years beyond the adoption of the GSP, which is planned for January of 2024. So our projected water budget period would be water year 2024 through 2073. And it takes into account estimated effects due to climate change and sea level rise, future water demand, and changes in local land use planning, population growth. So this is a graphic that DWR has provided that shows sort of the relationship between these different water budgets. So the historical water budget here is, for us, that was the period of 1985 through 2020. And then we also did a current water budget, which we selected the period of 2012 through 2020 to represent that. And then what we're doing is we're taking 50 years of historical data here, and then we're going to project that forward. So the basic idea here is that past is prologue to a certain extent, while taking into account, again, changes that might be to the hydrology due to climate change and other factors. So the first step in developing the projected water budget is selecting a base period. What 50-year period in the past are we going to use for this? Now, DWR has provided climate change data sets, which they refer to as change factors, for the historical period covering water year 1916 through 2011. The local precipitation record at the fire station covers a period of 1949, obviously through current. So the common period between these two data sets that we have to work with is 1949 through 2011, or a period of 63 years, which means we've got 14 different 50-year periods to choose from. Now, how do we select? What are the criteria? Well, these are the commonly accepted criteria for base period selection when doing water budgets for a groundwater basin. You want your period to include at least one period of overall wet and dry conditions, has an average precipitation that is close to the average for the entire period of record for your station. The beginning of the base period should start during a dry period to eliminate the potential for what's known as in-transit groundwater that may be occurring, that might be contributing to groundwater and storage that wouldn't be captured by your calculations. And then to the extent feasible, your period should begin and end at comparable points on the historical cumulative departure from the mean rainfall curve. So this table summarizes the 14 50-year periods we have to select from. So the first one, again, starts in 1949, and 50 years out would take it to 1998. And the last one could start in 1962 and go to 2011. Highlighted here is the period of 1953 to 2002, which we've selected for our base period. And I'll show you in a moment why that period best meets the criteria that I just mentioned. So this is a plot of the historical precipitation record at the fire station. So these blue bars, so this starts 1950 to 2020 here. These blue bars are the annual rainfall for each year. And what you can see here on this blue line is the cumulative departure from the mean curve. And what you can see for the 1953 to 2002 period. So what you can see is that we have 2 dry periods, actually, within this base period, and 2 wet periods, so we're satisfying that criteria. We start out with a dry period, and the mean for this 50-year period is 18.3 inches, which is a little bit more, but pretty close to the historical mean of 17.3 inches. And then you can also see that we start and end at fairly comparable points on the cumulative departure curve. So as Bob and I mentioned, DWR has provided climate change factors that we use to perturb, as they call it, the historical data to account for the anticipated effects of climate change. And they provided monthly change factors for these 5 aspects of the water budget calculation. So we have precipitation change factors, evapotranspiration, stream flow, sea level rise predictions, and then also anticipated changes to state water project deliveries. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is how we are incorporating these change factors into our water budget calculations. So the first is precipitation. The monthly change factors range, depending on which month you're talking about in that 50-year period, between 0 to as much as 300% of historical. But over that 50-year period, the average annual increase in precipitation is about 4%. So what that means is that the predicted climate change in precipitation is just a little bit more precipitation, a little bit wetter than historical. So what we do is we take those change factors and we apply them on a monthly basis to the historical rainfall to, like I say, perturb the precipitation. So what we have here is the bar chart on the bottom. I apologize, it's difficult to read, but we have the blue bars are the baseline, the actual historical, and the blue line is the cumulative departure from rainfall curve. It's the same curve I presented a couple of slides ago. And then the red is the result of perturbing that data using DWR climate change factors. And so what you can see if you look at any given year, some years we have a little bit less precipitation than historical, but in other years we have more precipitation than historical. And again, over the 50-year period, we have an average annual increase of about 4%. So in our perturbed or projected precipitation, we wind up with an average of 19.1 inches of rainfall compared to what happened in the past of 18.3 inches in that period. So the next is evapotranspiration. So again, the monthly change factors range anywhere between 3% less than historical to as much as 20% more evapotranspiration in the future. And the average annual increase over the 50-year period is 60%. Let me back up. So at the workshop in October, I discussed how we estimate how much rainfall percolates and recharges the groundwater basin. And basically it's a combination of using land use data and what are known as Blaney type curves, which were developed by an investigator at the USGS back in the 60s, where he related annual precipitation to deep percolation of rainfall on various types of land covers or land uses. And there are 3 types of land uses or soil covers in the basin that we're using for our calculations. So the next few slides, I'm going to show you the effects of incorporating the evapotranspiration change factors into how much deep percolation we're estimating occurs on those different types of land uses. So the first one is unirrigated native grass and weeds. So the solid yellow bars here show what we would estimate without taking into account the increase in evapotranspiration, and the hatched bars show what the amount of deep percolation would occur taking into account increases in evapotranspiration. So the basic effect of increased evapotranspiration is that it increases the amount of soil moisture deficiency in any given year, and so you need more rain in order to get an equivalent amount of deep percolation. So what we can see here on these native grass and weeds is that there are quite a few years here where we don't get any deep percolation on those unirrigated areas at all. And so we need a fair amount of rain to actually get any deep percolation on those types of soils. But then you can also see when you compare the historical to the perturbed that we have just a little bit less deep percolation or recharge occurring due to precipitation as a result of the increases in precipitation. So this next chart shows the same type of information for irrigated deciduous crops, so avocados, things like that. And what you can see here is that we have more years where we have deep percolation occurring because of the irrigation. There is less soil moisture deficiency that needs to be overcome when it does rain for it to percolate. But then also, as expected, you can see that the perturbed data, where we take into account the projected increases in evapotranspiration, we just have a little bit less deep percolation or recharge from rainfall occurring.
Question. You know, avocado, we don't think of them as a deciduous, we think of them as an evergreen, and pretty much all the crops grown in the valley. So is there a distinction there, or is there a lumping together of like orchard crops?
Yeah, there's a lumping. It's orchard. The way the district does their land use surveys on an annual basis, we have either irrigated orchards, irrigated crops, vacant land, residential, commercial, that sort of thing. So in our calculations, we do not draw distinctions between the different crop types. It's just either how many acres of irrigated orchard we have of whatever type. So we apply the Blaney deciduous curve to orchards, and then we apply Blaney's so-called truck crop curve to irrigated crops. So anything that's not deciduous, basically. So flowers, nurseries, strawberries, lettuces, those sorts of things. And what you can see here is, again, we have a fair amount more recharge occurring on these types of soils, reflecting probably more than anything else the differences in the shallower rooting depths of these types of crops and associated irrigation practices. And again, if you compare the historical in any given year to the projected, we're just having a little bit less deep percolation as a result of the increases in ET. So moving on to stream flow. DWR has also provided monthly change factors for stream flows throughout the state. And for the Carpinteria Creek, the change factors range between 20% of historical to as much as 160% of historical, again, depending on which particular year and month you're talking about. But the net effect of the stream flow climate change factors over the 50-year projected period is essentially nil. It's a wash. And so here's a similar graphic showing the effects of the perturbed data for stream flow. So again, on the horizontal axis or the x-axis, we have time, 2020, moving out to 2073 here. And what you can see is that in some years, again, we do have more stream flow being predicted, but in a lot of other years, it's a little bit less. And so the difference in the mean over the period is for the perturbed data, we're looking at an average of about 3160 acre-feet of discharge on the creek compared to the unperturbed historical data of about 2130 acre-feet a year. So it's essentially a wash.
Question?
Yes, sir.
You've lumped the rainfall and the stream flow and all into a yearly basis.
Yeah, for purposes of these graphics and the inventory, we're aggregating the monthlies.
Right. My understanding is that as we move into further and further into climate change, we should see more episodic rainfall and stream flow. In other words, we might have the same annual amount or slightly more, but it might come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Robert, can you repeat kind of summarize the question, just since we didn't have a mic live for that?
The gentleman's saying or pointing out that we have monthly change factors, but what I'm presenting here are annual summaries. And he's asking about whether or not the change factors in our calculations take into account the predicted on a monthly basis or a tighter time frame increases in precipitation and or stream flow, where essentially a lot of so let me back up a little bit and talk about how the change factors were developed by DWR. What they did is they took an assemblance of a variety, I think it was 20 some odd what are called global circulation models, or GCMs, and which take into account, depending on which GCM model you look at, you see quite a bit different sorts of predictions. And so what DWR did is they took like an assembly of them and then created what we're using is the so-called central tendency. So it's sort of an average of all of the global circulation models. And so that's sort of what the global circulation models, or GCMs, predict might happen, let's say in a February, like if February of 1953 repeats itself, and that happens in 2025, let's say, the global circulation models will provide a prediction for how much increased precipitation and stream flow might occur in that particular month, right? And so you might see a much wetter month in February predicted by the GCM, but lower rainfall in, let's say, April or May, something like that.
I think the answer is that yes, your projections do take that into account. I didn't realize you were looking at monthly.
Thank you. Yeah. Tonight I'm just presenting the annual averages just to kind of get it at a high level of what the sort of the overall effect is. So moving on to sea level rise. DWR's provided projections for this area of the coast, and they're projecting about 1/2 foot of sea level rise by 2030 and about 1.5 feet by 2070. And the way we deal with that is we've incorporated sea level rise into the groundwater model for this 50-year period. and the ocean boundary condition in the groundwater model is incrementally increased to account for rising sea level, and that affects the amount of boundary flows that go across the basin boundary between the Pacific Ocean and the basin. And so we've created a groundwater model scenario incorporating sea level rise as well as all of the other components. And as I said, we use the groundwater model for estimating boundary flows in the basin. So the other side of the water budget equation are extractions. So this table summarizes projected district pumping. And this, what we use for projecting district pumping is the district's 2020 Urban Water Management Plan, which takes into account the district's various sources of supply and demand, incorporates anticipated changes in land use and changes that might be occurring or what they can rely on in terms of Kachuma and State Water Project. And based on that information, has developed a plan for how they intend to use groundwater moving forward. So what you can see here is that in normal years, the district just plans on pumping 1,200 acre-feet a year, more or less as a flat rate. During dry years, however, depending on where we are in the future and whether we're talking about a single dry year or a multi-year drought, the district projects that they might pump as little as about 1,000 acre-feet a year under those conditions, up to as much as 2,150. But again, the basic idea here is that they really just plan on pumping more or less 1,200 acre-feet a year, as much as they can. So private agricultural pumping, the Urban Water Management Plan also estimated anticipated changes in agricultural demand in the basin because the district provides water to quite a few parcels in the basin. And essentially what the Urban Water Management Plan stated was that it does not anticipate significant changes in land use, agricultural land use practices in the basin, and is using 2020 as a baseline. And so the way we're doing this in the projected budget is we are using water year types, and we use the historical pumping estimates from our historical period of 1985 through 2020 and develop the average estimated private pumping that occurred historically under these different water year types, so wet to critical. And then what we've done in our budget is so in the projected future, each year has a water year type, and depending on the water year type and where we are in the sequence, we apply the evapotranspiration change factor to the estimated pumping through the 50-year period. So this table summarizes the baseline pumping. So it ranges anywhere from about 2,700 acre-feet a year during wet years up to as much as 3,300 in dry years. And that just reflects the fact that the less rain that you have, the more you're going to need to pump to keep your crops going. So results. This is a complicated graphic, but basically what this is it's a graphical representation of the annual inventory of inflows, outflows, and the cumulative change in storage that resulted from the water budget calculations that I just described. I won't go into all of these details of the different components, but what you can see on the inflow side, which is the upper half of the graph, and then the lower half of the graph is outflow, is that, you know, we have quite variable amounts of inflow. We can get, you know, a few years where we don't get much inflow, punctuated by periodic years where you get a lot of recharge. Pumping, on the other hand, and outflow from the basin doesn't change a whole lot through time. So the black curve here is the cumulative change in storage on an annual basis, and that reflects on a year-by-year basis, and then cumulatively the imbalance between inflows and outflows on a cumulative basis. So what you can see here is, again, we start out with a dry period here in our projected budget, and we have a cumulative depletion in storage here through 2032 or so. And then we get into a fairly extended period of just sort of alternating back and forth, wet and dry periods, and we don't see a whole lot of change in storage during this period. And then in projected year 2048, we get into a wet, cumulatively wet period, and you can see that we accrete storage during this period. Then we go back into another dry period. This actually corresponds with the historical period of the late 1980s, 1990 drought period. And so here we have a decline in storage. So you can see here we're pumping quite a bit, but there's very little recharge, and so we get a depletion in storage. But then coming out of that drought, we accrete some storage again, and then ending off here in the 2070s, we just have a little bit of a dry period there. The net at the end here, cumulatively at the end of the 50-year period, is about 10,000 acre-feet of storage depletion over that 50-year period. So this table summarizes all of that previous information just into annual averages for all of the different components. I'm not going to right now go into all of these different components and these different numbers. I'd be happy to do that in Q&A if someone has a specific question. But I think the bottom line message here is that we are estimating, on average, total recharge to the basin on the order of was about 4,600 acre-feet a year, or 47 rather, and outflows of about 4,900 acre-feet a year on average. And so the difference between the two, we have a deficit on average of about 200 acre-feet a year. So again, over that 50-year period, that works out to be about 10,000 acre-feet of storage depletion that's projected. So this is a chart. It's called a pair barred chart that Sigma or GSP regulations require. It's all of the same information that I presented here in this table, just in graphical form in these pair barred charts. And this red area here represents that 200 acre-feet a year deficiency or reduction in groundwater storage as a result of the imbalance between inflows and outflows. So next steps, what are we going to do with this budget? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we've already created a baseline no project groundwater scenario that we're going to use to simulate what basin water levels and response to pumping is going to look like under a no project condition over the course of the GSP implementation timeframe. And then we'll be using the model to simulate various projects and management actions that may be needed to meet the sustainable management criteria in the basin, or the SMCs, which Dave is going to talk about next. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't see, but maybe I missed it, that you've taken into account population growth.
Yes, ma'am.
You did take that into account?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
Yeah, that's incorporated into the district's pumping estimates from their urban water management plan.
are they taking into account this possibility of all these new projects that the state's enforcing on us to grow and add, excuse me, I'm poking. You don't, they did take that into account, you think, or you? No?
I would have to defer to General Manager Bob McDonald on what actually went into the urban water management plan. I didn't participate in the urban water management plan. I'm using the numbers they generated.
Yeah, the urban water management plan is the district's official estimate of water needs moving forward and water supplies, available water supplies. In that document, we do take into account projected land use changes. In 2020, this year, we used the regional housing needs assessment that the state is pushing out, which is really the basis for all of these changes that are occurring both at the county and the city of Carpinteria. Let me get.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Bob. Oh, so if that's the case, it surprises me that the district would be predicting 1,200 acre feet per year into the future. It seems as though, or does it mean that as residential or urban use increases, rural use decreases, and so, or did I misunderstand something there?
Yeah, no, you want me to take a stab at that, Bob, or?
Sure.
Yeah. I think what that reflects is a couple of things. One, the district compared to historical pumping. So if you look at the historical water budget, district pumping average pumping for the period of 1985 through 2020 was more like around 1,400 acre feet a year or so. But that captures, for one thing, that period of the late 80s and early 90s, which predated bringing in state project water, for one thing. And so the district was pumping quite hard during that period. Now they have state water project. The district also has a better understanding of the limitations of the groundwater basin and how much can be, or how much they feel they can safely take out. So I think what that reflects is that the district is basically saying, we know that the groundwater basin has some constraints and limitations. We're not necessarily going to use the groundwater basin in the future the same way that we have in the past. And they have other sources of supply that they're going to be using to make up that demand. So again, we have state water project. They have various groundwater banking programs going on. They're talking about a recycled water project, those sorts of things.
On these kind of studies, sometimes I used to see some type of probabilistic look at this kind of thing, where you see in the future, what if the housing came on? What if something else happened? And what would be the error in your number? It's more of an exact number, but that number it's wrong already, of course.
Of course, yes.
But do you look at sensitivities of this to kind of, is that how you're going to build your project list? Is around how big does it have to be to cover something like a Trump Tower, in downtown and Linden Avenue or something like that?
Yeah.
Have you thought about it? Is that something that you guys normally do, or is that not relative?
Well, I think it's an important point, but GSP regulations don't require us to do that sort of gaming or, a probabilistic sort of analysis or a sensitivity analysis. Well, what if your assumption about this is wrong and it's something else? Now, so we're meeting GSP regulations. If there's an interest to do that sort of thing, then certainly that's something that the GSA could discuss with the technical team, and it's worth considering. But the short answer is no, we're not going to be doing that as part of the GSP process and the GSP that we're working on right now. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about the GSP process is that we're developing a GSP right now. We have a deadline that we have to meet. We have to meet the regulations. We've got to get it done by January of 2024. But the GSP is going to be updated every 5 years throughout this 50-year period. So they're going to be, well, at the 5-year update, one of the things that will be looked at is, well, hey, we projected that this, that, or the other thing was going to happen, and yeah, this looks about right, but whoa, we were way off on this other thing. We need to make some adjustments moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. That's one of the things I was going to say is that these 5-year updates are meant to help us true up our assumptions, and it goes for water supply management as well. The Urban Water Management Planning Act requires 5-year updates. Sigma requires 5-year updates, and it's exactly that. We only are guessing what the future will hold, best available information, but we have to be able to true it up, and so that's what these processes are designed to do.
I'll look up one more question. I moved up so you wouldn't have to walk so far. So I want to add. Okay, that's plenty loud. So I want to ask Jim's question or make the observation in a different way, and mostly because we've got such a good example in the last couple of months. We got 18 inches of rain in 2 months. If that 18 inches of rain comes in 4 months, I would assume that it would be better for recharge of the basin. And to Jim's point, the predictions I've heard with climate change are that we should expect more of those episodic, as he said, events. Is that an accurate understanding? And you had said, I believe, that average rainfall is predicted to be 19 inches rather than 18 inches.
On average. On
average, which first tells me, great, that sounds good. But when I think of Jim's comment, I'm thinking it might not make any difference, or it may even be worse if it comes in those episodic events.
Right. Well, the climate change global circulation models is not my area of expertise, but it's my understanding that the global circulation models and then the DWR change factors are intended to take into account just what you're referring to. So, this would be getting into the weeds for this type of meeting, but, I could show you what the monthly change factors are for precipitation or stream flow. And you'll see that if you look at it on a monthly basis, they're kind of all over the place. Some months they're talking about, oh, it's going to be twice as much than was historical. And then in other months, it's half as much. And then in others, it's like, a couple % here or there. So we are sort of in a position of having to accept what the DWR's central tendency, sort of their best guess based on all of the various global circulation models, which if you've seen any of those predictions and see what they plot out in terms of changes in precipitation or evapotranspiration, it's like a spaghetti chart. They're just all over the place. So we are relying on DWR having done their best estimate using the best currently available information to take their best guess at what we think the effects of climate change are going to be on a monthly basis over the next 50 years. As another gentleman pointed out, though, it's already wrong. I mean, prediction is extremely difficult, as they say, especially about the future. So, this is a planning document. It's, as I mentioned, the purpose of the projected water budget is to say, okay, here's our best guess of what we think the future is going to be like. What's the basin going to look like under those conditions? What do those conditions look like relative to the sustainable management criteria that we're going to be developing here? And what sorts of projects or management actions might need to be implemented in the basin in order to achieve those sustainable management criteria? And the development of the SMCs, as Dave is going to discuss, is a collaborative process between all of you folks and the stakeholders in the basin and the GSA and the technical team. So there's going to be a feedback loop in terms of the establishment of the various SMCs. This is about getting consensus to as much as we can within the basin and the various stakeholders and users in the basin of what seems reasonable for planning purposes at this point and moving forward. Again, keeping in mind that every 5 years we're going to have an opportunity to change things if the data suggests that that's what needs to happen.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Dave O'Rourke. I'm a hydrogeologist with GSI Water Solutions. I'm going to here to talk to you about the sustainability management criteria, particularly as they apply to seawater intrusion, which, as I'm going to discuss, is probably going to be the driver in this basin. This is just a brief outline of the topics I tend to uncover. I'm going to quickly review some of the terminology for SGMA and the sustainability management criteria, or SMCs. Then I'm going to specifically address the seawater intrusion SMCs. We're going to look at the data that was available and that we looked at, the definitions of how we need to define these SMCs in terms specifically as it's laid out in SGMA, and where we landed on the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives and what we intend to propose in the GSP. Then I'm just going to start on an introduction to the next sustainability indicator, the decline of water levels and reduction of groundwater and storage. We're not really going to get into the meat and potatoes of that tonight, but we're just going to set it up for the next meeting. And, next steps in Q&A. So just as a reminder, I went over this last month, but there are 6 different sustainability indicators defined in the language of SGMA. Seawater intrusion, chronic lowering of groundwater levels, reduction of groundwater storage, water quality degradation, surface water groundwater interaction, and land subsidence. As is evidenced in the data I'm going to be discussing, seawater intrusion is probably the most significant sustainability indicator in this basin. So we're going to address that first, take care of it first. And like I said, I'll be doing an introduction to the next 2, which are frequently addressed together. And we'll save these last 3 for next month or possibly the month after. Just a couple of there's a lot of acronyms involved. I'm just going to go over the most significant ones. A minimum threshold is MT. That is essentially the low value that, triggers action under Sigma. It is a threshold that you define where if you exceed it or go lower than it, as the case may be, that triggers an action. It might be start with a study and then move to a management action, but the minimum threshold is the level that, that when you exceed it, something has to happen. The measurable objective is the higher level. I mean, if we're talking in terms of water levels, it's a higher water level. It's a goal. It's kind of aspirational. You don't get dinged if you don't manage to the measurable objective, but that's what you're trying to get to. So all of these are referred to collectively as SMCs. Interim milestones are just 5-year interim targets for these sustainable management criteria. And RMS, I'll be using that a lot, is the representative monitoring sites. It's just basically a set of wells that we use to monitor and define these SMCs. So big ones are MT and MO. That's the one I'll be saying a lot. So, this is just the relationship between these. The sustainability indicator is the overarching, seawater intrusion. The SMCs are the criteria that you define for that sustainability indicator. MOs, MTs, and interim milestones, those are all examples of SMCs. And if you exceed the MTs enough times, that leads to an undesirable result and it triggers an action. Again, the MOs are sort of a goal. The MTs have the teeth. That's when something's got to happen. And then this is just sort of a graphic demonstrating the fact that everything is centered around the RMS wells that you pick. The sustainable management criteria are the MTs and MOs. You define those and you measure them at the RMS wells that you select. RMS wells are a smaller subset of what is probably a larger monitoring network that you use to do water level maps and collect water quality data from. But RMS wells are a subset of those specifically defined in Sigma to measure your sustainable management criteria. And then, when we get to projects and management actions, projects are generally things that you think of that might increase supply. Management actions might reduce demand or at least manage demand. And you measure the effects of those at the RMS wells. So everything is measured and defined at the RMS wells. All right, so now we're going to get into specific discussion of seawater intrusion here. Now, the undesirable results, there's nothing tricky about what these are. It's just things that we want to avoid, like saline groundwater from the ocean migrating inland and reaching agricultural wells. And, increasing the chloride content of water that you put on crops will reduce the crop yield. It affects the agricultural economy. Farmers have less yield, make less money. That's clearly undesirable. Saline water reaching municipal or domestic production wells, although there's not much in the way of private domestic production wells in this basin. But saline water reaching municipal wells or district wells could impact water quality for everybody's potable supply source, requiring to engage in a higher level of treatment, costs money, everybody's water bill goes up. That's definitely undesirable. So there's nothing technical or tricky about what these undesirable results that we're trying to avoid. This is a general selection criteria for what we want in an RMS well. Like I mentioned earlier, these are specifically selected for the purposes of Sigma. Carp Basin has about 45 wells in their monitoring network right now. We're talking about taking a subset of those, 10 or 15, to define as RMS wells for the various sustainable management criteria. The things that you would like to see in an RMS well are things like, located in areas of interest or where there is no data now, data gaps. It's got to be accessible. It's best if it has a long period of record for either water levels or water quality. It's better if you know the well construction details, such as total depth, screened interval. Lots of times you do. Lots of times you don't, Now that doesn't mean you can't use it as an RMS well, but certainly as you move forward, you'd want to video that well and find out these details. And it's preferred if it's a dedicated monitoring well, like it's not used as a pumping well, but that also is not an absolute requirement. In a perfect world, we'd have 15 or 20 dedicated monitoring wells that don't have pumps in them and aren't used, but as we move into the future, there will be more monitor wells constructed, almost certainly. All right, so, I mentioned that seawater intrusion is likely the driver here. Why are we saying that? Well, we're not just making it up. This is just a reminder of what's going on at the Sentinel wells, what we call the Sentinel wells that the district constructed back in 2019. This is just a diagram that shows that the aquifer out there has 3 productive zones. We're calling them the A, B, and C zone, right? As you go from shallower to deeper. And these charts are what's been going on with chloride and water level in these 3 Sentinel wells. In the A zone, which is the shallowest well, you can see water level declined recently during the drought, but chloride, which is the little blue cross, it's been stable, it's been low. Now, I do want to stop briefly and talk about this line. This is the secondary MCL for chloride. MCL stands for maximum contaminant level. It's really a drinking water term. There's drinking water regulations that define maximum contaminant levels for various constituents. Primary MCLs are constituents that have an effect on human health, a demonstrated effect on human health, arsenic, nitrates, things like that. Secondary MCLs have no effect on human health. They're more taste and odor characteristics. So chloride falls into that category. If you drink water at 250 milligrams per liter, nothing's going to happen to you, but you'll probably taste it a little salty. So we just are showing the secondary MCL, which is 250 milligrams per liter on these graphs. So in the A zone, even though water levels declined, chloride stayed stable and well below the secondary MCL. In the B zone, you can see that water levels declined recently, and somewhat counterintuitively, the chloride levels have actually declined recently. But these are laboratory results. This is this is real data, and it is currently well below the secondary MCL. Now the C zone, which is the deep zone, and again, these Sentinel wells are located right here, right on the coast. This has seen a steady increase in chloride, since 2019. In 2019, chlorides were below the MCL. A year later, they were a little bit above it, and they've steadily climbed since. So this is, in fact, indicative data that seawater intrusion is happening at the coast in the C zone at this well.
Is that C zone relative permeability of the salt water when it comes up? Fresh water comes back down again maybe someday. Are we losing relative perm of the salt water? Is it right? We don't lose storage. Is it lost, I guess I'm saying?
I don't think it makes you lose storage, no. But it remains to be seen how long it might take, to get pushed back out, if at all, during a wet period. But, my point is, it's happening. This is real data. It's documented. So that's why, we think seawater intrusion is the driving SMC for this basin. The district has already got, well, you'll be seeing this in another, but they've already got plans for additional monitoring wells, additional, clusters of sentinel wells, up and down the coast to further document and better document this process.
Question. Do you think the greater sensitivity in the C zone is due to the differential in density, saltwater versus fresh, or a greater connectivity?
I think it's, the salt water is denser, so it does sink. Fresh water generally sits on top of salt water. So it's not surprising that the lower zones would experience it first. It is all quite recent, though. I mean, this is just the last 4 years that we've been seeing this, really the last 3 years that we're seeing this trend. And we're not seeing it in the B zone, we're not seeing it in the A zone, we're not seeing it anywhere else in the district, for the time being. But as I said, they have plans for additional, clustered monitoring wells along the coast here to keep an eye on it. Mm-hmm.
My answer to that question is yes.
I can't just say that. So this is a shot of maximum chloride in the district's monitoring wells since 2015. There's a couple of things to point out here. Keep in mind that 250 is the secondary MCL for chloride. There are very few wells in the basin that exceed that. In fact, the vast preponderance of these wells are, below 100. Now, there's a couple of clear, exceptions to that rule. This 1,000, that's the Sentinel well that I just told you about, and that's right on the coast. Now, another interesting area is these ones up here by Arroyo Paradon, that oval's a little bit off center. But it was discussed in the chapter 3 of the HCM that Robert wrote that there is some poor quality water flowing down this creek. Nobody's really done a study on it. Perhaps there's some geothermal springs that are discharging to the creek, but there are surface water samples that have been taken that have poor water quality, high total dissolved solids, et cetera. And so these two wells are right near Arroyo Paradon Creek. It's not our intent or the intent of Sigma to clean up wells like this where the natural water quality indicators, are poor. I mean, this happens, not all groundwater that you find is going to be pristine groundwater. So when we define our criteria and our MTs and MOs, I would say that they will specifically exclude this area. We're not going to try and get this 600 milligrams per liter of chloride down to 100. So that's one thing. Another thing I'm going to point out is, and I'll show you a geologic cross-section in the next one, these red lines are faults. It's the Rincon Creek fault on top and the Carpinteria fault down here. The juxtaposition of geologic materials that occurs as a result of these faults pretty much preclude seawater intrusion from happening like on this whole half of the basin. It's this part of the basin where, there's no faulting and the seawater, is in direct contact with some of the aquifer layers where it happens. So when we define our criteria, we're going to exclude this area. There's no need to draw lines, down here. And I'll show you the next slide's going to be a cross section. But, the take home is most, this is the central part of the basin. There's certainly no indication there of any seawater intrusion. I'd also say this Arroyo Paradon area, nobody really thinks that's seawater intrusion. It's probably as a result of the poor quality water in the creek there. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to point out on this one. All right, these are the cross sections I talked about. So this is a geologic map. These thick blue lines are the cross section lines, and these thick red lines are the faults that I just showed you. So this one, CC prime, you can see, the fault is basically out at sea, and the ocean comes in here and is in direct contact with some of these, the basin sediments. So it could happen there. Down here in this part of the basin, you can see that there's two offsets of faults. Faults are commonly thought to be barriers to groundwater flow. In addition, the bedrock, the bedrock that underlies the ocean out there is not, highly conductive. It doesn't transmit groundwater readily. So, the ocean ends here. It's got to get through, tight bedrock and two faults, to make it in there. So the geology protects the basin in that southeastern part of the basin from seawater intrusion. So just making that point. So how do we define the SMC for seawater intrusion? Well, we are told specifically how to do it. It's got to be defined as an isocontour. I'll be dropping that word a lot in the next few minutes. And it's just a line where a contour line where the concentration is of equal value. So we draw a line of 100 milligrams per liter. Everything on one side of it is less than 100. Everything on the other side is more. Now, when we draw these lines, we don't necessarily have to have them defined today. This basin's got a pretty good amount of water quality data, but not enough that we could accurately draw a real specific line. But we can draw it where we want it to be and then monitor along that line in the future. So again, the minimum threshold, the MT, it's going to be defined by the chloride concentration isocontour for the principal aquifer. This basin is it's essentially a single principal aquifer. It's got more than one productive zone, but those aren't standalone aquifers. But we're monitoring the zones. But, I don't think it's our intent to draw 3 different isocontours. We'll draw one and monitor all zones. All right, so where might we draw these things? We've had a couple of technical meetings. You could be super aggressive and say, we want to draw that line right along the coast. Right? We don't want any water coming in at all. That would be lovely, but then you would have to monitor along the coast, and that would involve drilling wells on the beach. Coastal Commission would have some input on that. So, you could choose that, but it would be overly aggressive and tough to enforce and define. The second option we were talking about, all right, well, let's make it sort of like halfway between the coast and, the main known active producing wells in the basin. So that's sort of what this second option would be. These dots are basically active wells that were identified. They're listed as either active or in service or district wells. And the third one would be, well, let's just draw a line through the active wells that we know and say that's where we want to define, our criteria. The things that you would consider when drawing the line are, like I say, on the coast, inland, the distance, the location of the line or distance to potential receptor wells. Keep in mind, we're talking groundwater. This isn't surface water. The velocity is not feet per second. It's feet per year. So if your monitoring program is robust enough, you'll see things in time to react. You know, you want to look at existing water quality data, like that maximum from 2015 that I just showed, and just logistics of monitoring. That sort of like, I just mean like we couldn't put them all on the beach, you know, that just wouldn't work out. So, you know, these are sort of a couple of options. You know, option one, you know, that dropped out. 2 and 3, we continued to consider. This shows, okay, this actually shows what our proposed RMS wells. I can see that the colors didn't turn out too well, but we've got 5 wells that are identified here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is actually 3 wells. This is the Sentinel well cluster that exist, you know, that we say, okay, they're close enough to the ocean. Let's identify these as RMS wells and we'll keep an eye on them. There's these other lighter green dots. There's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then a couple over here, Carl Park. The district is currently already applied for funding, you know, to increase their seawater intrusion monitoring network. You know, these are all potential locations. You know, I should have stamped draft on this, but, you know, it's not a given that they're going to be exactly where those are. But my point is the district's already working and applying for funding to improve their monitoring network. So, you know, certainly they'd probably put one here, maybe one near the estuary. There's a cluster going in this year, right, Bob, in Carl Park? And yes. That's this one. So at present, you know, we've selected 5 sites for RMS wells, and one of them is a cluster of 3, so 7 wells, really. These graphs show what the, you know, the transient chloride concentrations in each of these wells. Again, the dashed line is the secondary MCL of 250. So this one's pretty close to the ocean, but you can see it's down there around 25. There's one little spike there. Who knows what that might have been. Laboratories can occasionally offer some spurious results. This one, there's only a couple of data points, but it's well below 50. This one here, that's the headquarters well, or the... Again?
Question?
Sure.
Given that you've got 3 aquifers, we're talking about a single...
3
3
zones.
zones. They don't behave the same. We see that Zone C is got a problem. And we're looking at a single isoline. Are you looking at using an average of those 3?
No, I would say, you know, we would draw the line and then monitor all 3 of the zones. You know, like the Sentinel wells, there's 3 separate wells that monitor those 3 separate zones.
And then if one of those zones hit an MT, it would trigger action?
That's correct. You know,
Okay.
Generally the first action is going to be a study. You know, is this real? Is it widespread? You know, is it happening at other wells or is it isolated? Like, you know, what I showed you for the Sentinel wells, there's nothing, you know, no alarming trends in A and B. It's just been in C, and it's just been for a few years. So, you know, if it starts raining again here, we'll keep a close eye on it over the next 5 years. But, so yeah. I'd say we draw the line and we just monitor all the zones. And I'll go on and say, you know, this isn't a layer cake, this basin, right? It's not like it's just A, B, C. It's that way in certain wells, but we don't clearly you know, those cross sections are based on points that are thousands of feet apart. You know, it's not well understood how C zone might connect to B zone as you move away from one. So I'd say, you know, as they improve their monitoring network, we'll just keep an eye on all 3 zones and apply the same criteria to all of them. Okay? Whoops. This one's kind of, we use the same x-axis. These are the sentinel wells, they're kind of hard to define, but you can see that, it goes up to 700 or 800 in 2020 there, but I've already talked about that data with you. So again, we've selected 5 RMS well locations, 7 actual RMS wells. There's grant application in for funding for additional ones, and all future monitoring effort is certainly going to be focused on that. It's going to be along the coast. So again, this is just the same, possible alternative isocontour lines. I just put it over with with the maximum recent chloride concentration. So this is just sort of a merger of a couple of the previous slides. So along here, if this was going to be 100, other than the C zone well, which is here, most of the wells on the landward side of it would make that. This is one that is essentially done by, like I said, we connected a line between active wells. And so we just wanted to throw this on to see if anything jumped out as unmanageable, unreasonable. The only thing that really did is this Arroyo Paradon area. So as I said, that's documented that's already got, poor, high chlorides. And so we're not going to try and manage those numbers back down. So after, discussing what is a good way to go, we came up with, using both of these 2 separate lines. So again, the option of right along the coast, that dropped out pretty quickly for just logistical reasons. And we were saying, okay, well, the minimum threshold or the measurable objective, right, which is the more aspirational one, we'll put that closer to the coast. So that's this one. And we'll make the MO there to be 100 milligrams per liter. Again, most of the wells behind it already meet that. And most of the, all future monitoring will be, located probably seaward of that line. So in the coming years, we'll be able to keep a close eye along that line. And then we said that MT, things that would trigger action, we set that at 250, which is the MCL. And we defined it as a line that, goes through current active wells. So we can keep an eye on monitoring along the 100 MGL line, and we'll know if there's any sort of inexorable trends that are happening. And then, that'll sort of be the front line, to see if things are in fact moving inland. And then the things that would trigger actions would be chlorides in excess of the MCL along the most seaward active wells. A lot of them are ag wells, some of them are district wells. So that's the strategy we came up with, an MO line closer to the ocean where monitoring will be concentrated, and an MT line that actually connects current active wells. And again, none of them extend, beyond the Rincon Creek fault. There might be some details about how we draw these lines, like, it probably doesn't make sense to have this line come way over here, maybe have it sort of mimic the curve on 101. But that is that's what we're going to propose. We think it's defensible. We think with monitoring data, we'll be able to, keep an eye on things along the coast here where it might, where we're at risk of seawater intrusion. Again, it'll exclude Arroyo Paradon area where, we're not trying to fix areas that are already high. Yeah?
That would have to be in the C zone, would it?
Those, no, I don't believe so.
They're not?
There's only a couple of wells that are constructed down into the C zone. Because, most farmers, they don't want to go down to 1,200, 1,400 feet if they don't have to. It costs a lot of money to put a well that deep. So that's also why I mentioned earlier, we don't have a real good understanding of the interaction between C and B, but we know it's happening at the Sentinel wells. So, all future wells will certainly have an A, B, and C zone along the coast.
Two questions. One is option 2 only works if you get those other wells in, right? Because you won't know otherwise what's going on there.
Right, the proposed monitoring wells?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right now, we've just got a single data point.
Yeah.
So yes.
The second question, you had mentioned earlier on about having 45 monitoring wells, I believe, or something like that. I would imagine that very few of those are dedicated for monitoring, and most of those are private wells that are part of the district system that private owners are cooperating with.
Certainly more than half of them are private wells. Most of those 45 are used for measuring water levels. A lesser number, maybe 30. All these wells that have chloride values on them, those are monitored regularly for water quality. They actually sample them, about 30 or so. So there's, pretty good data through, a transient time series of data on these wells. But, where we want it, right along the coast, not so much. But again, the district's already working to improve that. I don't think they're going to be putting in new monitoring wells upslope here or down here. Although they do need something in Ventura County, as we mentioned before. But it's, the main sustainability indicator that poses a threat to this basin is seawater intrusion. So that's going to be the focus of future monitoring efforts for the new wells.
Another question. On that second line with essentially the MT line that's inland, if you hit that MT level, would plan future actions be, would the horse be out of the barn at that point, or could a management action successfully reverse that?
Great question. To some extent, it might be out of the barn, right? But that's why the monitoring effort would be the front line. So we'd see it coming. And then if individual wells, along the MT line start popping up high, there would have to be management actions, and, there are already projects on the books, the CAP project and what have you, that might alleviate this. And the districts, they're way ahead of Sigma, quite frankly.
I'll try to answer that question.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity to plug the CAP project, which is a new water supply for Carpinteria, and that'll add water supply to our portfolio, which offsets groundwater pressure and enables us to add to the solution here. We're going to be injecting that water into the ground, so that's going to have a benefit on water levels, which is correlated with seawater intrusion. If you can keep the water levels high enough, then seawater doesn't move inland. So we're already working on tools. There's the possibility that you see it coming even with the CAP project, even with whatever management actions that we decide on. We could put in barrier wells, basically injection wells along the coast that are going to mound water, basically stopping any progress of seawater. So we're already thinking about those things, but again, we have to look at the data to justify those expenditures and justify the, implementation of those programs.
So why was the MT line not where the MO line is? It seems like you want the most advanced warning you can have. By the time you get to the MT, you have a problem.
Well, you know, to some extent, you want to avoid managing to failure, right? I mean, you don't want to set a line. I mean, okay, we're already at 1,000 right there in the C zone. So if you were to define, I mean, initially I was thinking we'd be drawing this line through the Sentinel wells, and I was like, what are we going to do? We're already going to be, you know, busting an MT right out the gate. And after discussion, I was like, well, you don't have to draw it there, you know, draw it back a little ways. I'm like, yeah, that makes more sense, you know, between the ocean and the receptor wells. So that's one thing, you know, you don't benefit from defining a criteria that's overly aggressive, because everything you define is going to have implications, cost implications, implications if you can't meet it. You know, I've seen that in some other basins where, you know, they have water level MTs and they set them too aggressively, and the first annual report came out and they're already below. So that doesn't help anybody, you know. So in one sense, it's sort of a, you know, management of what you can achieve. And then also, you know, the actual, I mean, so I get what you're saying, but the monitoring wells will be there. So we'll be able to see. And so if we start seeing 250s along, you know, 3 or 4 new clusters of Sentinel wells, you know, we'll have time before it gets to the next line. So, you know, these things wouldn't operate in a vacuum. We're defining it at the actual receptor wells that would be impacted, but we'll be monitoring it along the MO line.
I would think another addition to that answer would be that we don't have the historical data for that problem. It may be a normal thing that happens over a period of 100 years, and
right.
It sort of fixes itself sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll see what happens, you know, if we ever get out of this drought, you know, we'll see what happens over the next 5 years. It'll be interesting when we revisit this in 5 years, but so I guess, you know, that's my answer is, you know, it doesn't pay to be overly aggressive. We can keep an eye on it for 5 years. You know, this thing's got to be revised every 5 years, and then we'll see, well, maybe we should have been more aggressive. Maybe let's revise this. But for now, you know, we think this is defensible. It doesn't put us in danger of immediate failure. And when the new monitoring systems go in, we'll have a good system as a forward line of defense. Not defense, but observation anyway.
Dave, so along those lines, we can manage to the MO versus the MT. In fact, probably that would be the preferable approach, is watching the MO. That gives us information enough to start managing and developing projects before it gets to the MT. The MT is sort of the backstop. We don't want to let that ever hit the level. And so it really it doesn't define something you manage to. You manage to something.
You manage to avoid it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the strategy for defining the SMCs for seawater intrusion. You know, there'll be more data than I just presented, you know, in the text of the chapter, but you know, barring any big problems with stakeholders or the public or the stakeholder advisory group, you know, that's what we're proposing. We'll see how the PAC, the TAC, the SAG, the stakeholder advisory group, will see what they have, what they think about it, and we have our first meeting in about a week and a half. But that's what we're going to propose. So, okay, so now I'm just going to get started on the SMCs of lowering of groundwater levels and reduction of groundwater storage. I'm presenting these together because they are frequently presented together in other basins because they are highly, highly correlated. Obviously, if your water levels are lower, then your storage has reduced. If your water levels increase, then your storage has increased. So there's also some other analysis of storage using the model, like the water budget that Robert just presented. But you don't define the SMCs using that. That's more of an additional level of analysis. So just going to talk a little bit about the data that's involved in them, how we might define them. I'm not going to show all 11 or 12 or 14 hydrographs. Come back next month for that. But the undesirable results, keep in mind, undesirable results are supposed to be significant and unreasonable. It doesn't mean that there can be no decline of water levels, If you said, hey, we want the water levels to be able to drop the water levels another 100 feet, well, that would be significant and unreasonable. But so the things that you want to avoid that would be undesirable results for these criteria be for municipal wells, you don't want water levels falling below the screened interval, and that's just for operational purposes. If you do that, then water gets aerated, it changes the quality, or has the potential to change the quality, so that's an undesirable result. Decline in yields of agricultural wells, that's an undesirable result because it would affect the local economy. Private domestic supply wells, again, there's really not many of those or really any of those that are being used for supply in this basin. The type of data that you'd analyze for defining these are, well locations. Some areas might be more sensitive than others. For example, defining water level MTs along the coast, that's going to have a lot of interaction with seawater intrusion. Defining MTs for an ag well that's up at an elevation of 200 or 300 at the top, north end of the basin, that's, will not have that much interaction with seawater intrusion. But location, depth, screened interval, and pumping patterns. This is just the point that I just made. A reduction in storage criteria can be and usually are defined as water levels at individual wells, and it's usually the same one as the water level decline. Again, there's additional analysis that can be done with the model and stuff, but as far as defining the MTs, these usually go hand in hand. We have gone ahead and picked some wells for proposed RMS wells for these two criteria. The things that you want to define when picking them are, the longer period of record, the better. Known construction details, kind of the same things I went over previously for seawater intrusion. Dedicated monitoring wells are preferred. Accessibility. When selecting these, these blue ones are a subset of the district monitoring wells, which are the orange ones. And all those little black dots are wells that are registered with the district, but they're not being used for monitoring or anything. They know they're there. They have some information on them. The main ones we used when selecting these was, spatial distribution. We pretty much wanted one in each section, of the basin. Period of record, the longer period of record, the better. A lot of these wells have water level records going back to the 40s, and that's sweet, I got to tell you. Some of them just go back to the 90s, but there's, I believe, 14 of them here, including the 3 Sentinel wells. I don't expect you to read this table, but this will be going into PowerPoint will be going into the record. You can check it at your leisure and see the data that we have on these. You can see, water level data since some of these are, 1941, 1940. Some of them go way back. Some of them are quite recent, some of the district wells. But, we've got owner, use, whether it's been measured for water levels. Some of them have been measured for water quality. This is just the data that we have. So this data applies to the map I showed you in the this map. So all the blue wells here are represented on this table, and you can look at this table at your leisure. All right, I showed these last month, but these are just screenshots or illustrations from the best management practice for the SMCs. This type of hydrograph, doesn't really apply to this basin. I mean, this looks like the Central Valley, right, where there's just this steady, inexorable decline of water levels. San Joaquin Valley, where it's been dropping since the 50s, and it's dropped 300 feet in some areas, In that case, this is when sigma starts. You would define an MT, obviously lower than you are at today, and then your MO would be higher than that to reflect projects and management actions that you'll implement in the next 20 years. Again, the character of this hydrograph isn't really reflected much in the hydrographs in this basin. The hydrographs here, they go up and down. There's been some recent declines. Obviously, the droughts are quite visible. But this is, that's how you would pick an MT and an MO. I mean, this is the same one, same basic figure. It just shows the measurable objective. And the interim milestones. Interim milestones are really, I mean, they specifically apply to water levels. There's no interim milestones for seawater intrusion or most of the other, sustainability criteria. There's no interim milestones for land subsidence and things like that. The IMs specifically refer to water levels, and they specifically refer to trying to recover water levels. But anyway, here's the historical data. Your MT is as low as you want to get, and then you want to recover above it. Okay, now this is a hydrograph from this basin. You can see it's up here toward the north end of the basin. You don't see that steady decline over 50 years. You could argue that it's been declining for the last 15 or 20 years, but, it's also got the drought in here. At this point, the drought got about as low as it was back in the 50s, but things were pretty different back then. I'll show that in the next one. But, so what might we pick? We might say, hey, at this point in 2017, the things you can do is like check the screen intervals of wells around there. If this water level stays above those screen intervals, then you could argue that no undesirable effects were observed, right? So maybe it's okay to put it at this recent low, even though it was a drought low. Was water supply affected? Did the farmers around there, did they have to alter their practices at all? Or were they just fine? If there were no unreasonable effects observed, you could make a reasonable argument that this low point might be a reasonable MT to define. If there were unreasonable effects observed, if wells did go dry or farmers did have to reduce their pumping because of the lowered water levels, well, then you'd probably want to define it a little higher because you don't want those undesirable effects to occur again. Also for water levels, keep in mind that, they generally want to apply them to average conditions. This is a 10-year drought. Do you want to manage to that? You could. If you didn't observe any unreasonable effects, then that would be okay. You probably wouldn't want to go lower than that here, although, I can see a farmer going, things were great, we could have used another 10 feet, nothing happened. And they might argue for that, but it's an iterative process. The stakeholders get to weigh in and ultimately, define what they think is reasonable. But this just shows that, a hydrograph over an 80-year period. You got a drought in the 50s, you got the drought in the 80s and 90s, and you got the recent drought. And so it was lower recently than in the 90s. That might not be the case. You might be looking at a previous drought as the lowest low and say, well, is that reasonable to define it? But, personally, my initial, inclination is to look at the recent historical low and determine if there were any unreasonable effects. Check the screen levels, check the dry well records, check to see if anybody's practices were affected. If no, then I would argue that that's a reasonable approach. But you can't just, you got to come up with something to argue. You can't just go, oh yeah, we're just going to do that, DWR. Next, there's got to be some analysis behind it. And so like the 2 or 3 things I just mentioned, checking water levels against other screen intervals, checking to see if supply was affected at all, if anything went dry, those things, would be considered for each well. Here's one that goes back to the 40s. This is up here. What'd you call that? What, Shepherd Mesa? Yeah. Here's our recent drought. It is at an elevation of 150. Back in the 50s, it was at an elevation of like 50. So somebody might look at this and go, hey man, the world didn't come to an end in 1955. We can set it there. The problem with that is we don't know what was happening back then. Land use, was a lot different then. Pumping patterns were a lot different. It would probably be hard to justify, even though that's the historical low, it's so far back and there's so little data. It might be tough. That might be a tough sell to DWR. The 90s drought, it only dropped things down to like 200, and then the recent drought, it went down another 50 feet to 150. But again, you'd go through the same process, Was anybody's supply affected? Did any wells go dry? Check the screens of the wells around them. Was this water level elevation still above those screens? If so, then, you could make an argument that that might be a reasonable MT. If there were effects observed, then you'd probably want to go higher, okay? And this is the kind of thing we'll be talking about in more detail at the next meeting. You're going to be seeing a lot of these 4 weeks from now, So what's next, just in terms of the workshops, Bob mentioned earlier on, there's a workshop in the middle of March where we will discuss water level and storage decline, SMCs, probably exhaustively and exclusively. And then another one in April where we'll probably address the other 3. We'll wrap up. They're not as significant. That's land subsidence, surface water, groundwater interaction, and water quality. And then, that could roll over into May, but hopefully by at least part of the May meeting, we'll be starting in on projects and management actions. We'll be talking about the CAP project, the intrusion barrier concept, things like that would help preserve conditions in the basin so that no unreasonable effects are observed. So in summary, I just want to say again, this basin is, although it's a high priority basin, the situation is nothing like, the Central Valley. The issues here seem addressable. There's not a huge gap and, it's not a huge deficit in storage. There's already motion, projects in motion to improve monitoring and reduce pumping through the CAP project for the district, things like that. So with that, I'll take any additional questions.
Maybe more of an observation than anything, but one of those last charts you put up, it would be really nice to have a chart of what is predicted for state water availability. And I know Bob's thinking about this. I'm thinking he is. Because as you're looking at your crystal ball and looking into the future, the cost of state water and the acceptable price to the customer, if the district can shift off of groundwater for 4 years, which you have done in recent past, and draw less or nothing from the groundwater and basically used state water in place of that, then that would make, I would think, a huge difference in the recovery of the groundwater basin.
It absolutely would.
And we may not have the rainfall here in those periods, but they may have it in Northern California where the state water is coming from. And so it adds a whole other dimension and maybe a little more optimism to the scenario.
Yeah, and I'd say, I'll point out, you know, in general, I would say that, you know, climate change, you know, might somewhat reduce state water availability, but what has happened recently, I'm sure you're aware of it, I don't know what the term is, but they're reworking all the contracts between the state water contractors so that they're easing up the legal requirements to sort of, you know, trade and be able to move water around. It was really quite difficult to do that in the past, and I know that's getting addressed, you know, because the legislature sees what's happening, and it would be great if, you know, CARP said, well, we got a state water allocation, we really don't need it right now, you know, maybe Santa Barbara could use it, we could sell it to them, make some money, put in a couple new wells, whatever, that sort of thing. It's happening on the policy side. I'd say also in general what you're talking about would somewhat be reflected in the future model runs, right? Because the urban water management plan has those assumptions sort of baked into it, maybe not to the degree that you're talking about or that I'm talking about, but certainly to some degree.
Yeah, I'll also add a little bit to that. So in the urban water management plan, we had the average number of 1,200 acre feet per year. The reality is we pump anywhere from 0 acre feet all the way up to 2,500 acre feet in a year, and that just depends on the water supply needs. Sometimes State Water Project is there, sometimes it's not, sometimes Kachuma is there, sometimes it's not. We really have to be able to switch back and forth, but our goal is to average that 1,200 per year. And certainly in 2017, when it was wet here, we shut down all of our wells. 2019, we did the same thing. And so you'll see that if you look at the district's pumping, it's high up to 2016. 2017, it's nearly 0. 2018, it's kind of mid. 2019, it goes back down to 0. 21, you know, it's kind of doing this, but, you know, while we're doing that, we're tracking and saying, okay, we want to be on average 1,200. So as water becomes available in other supplies, we shift over, and that's just the nature of water supply management.
Are you doing anything about private well owners selling their water to, say, Montecito, as I know it's been done in the past? I know there's been talk, we've never in the state controlled the aquifers and kept that kind of thing from going on. Is it still going on, and do you want to do anything about it, or?
I'll try to answer that one.
So
what you're talking about is a phenomena that occurred early, I think 2014. We saw a lot of water was being exported into Montecito for various landscape purposes. And that's really outside the domain of SGMA. Yeah. But what it is, it falls under land use and conditional use permits through the county and the city. In this case, it was the county. And so the county did sort of shut the gate and tell all of the truckers in particular, if you're going to move water, you have to get a conditional use permit. And of course, they weren't issuing conditional use permits for moving water. And so that has been largely effective in reducing that activity.
They just did it through trucking, like the guy pull up to your well and fill up his truck and
yes.
drive to Montecito?
They started moving water through hydrants. When the water district said, you can't do that, then they went to the well owners And then the county said, you can't do that. And so then they went to Casitas Water. So,
Okay. I used to see the truck at Casitas pass when the guy was having breakfast. I chatted with him about what he was doing. I really got kind of upset.
Yeah.
You're stealing my water.
these were small amounts of water, but I think in principle, it was the wrong thing to be doing. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.